Hi, today we're going to talk about the Book of Mormon translation. Particularly we're going to look a little bit at this idea of early modern English, what I call EME, which has become kind of a new fad for some of the intellectuals in the church to explain the translation and how Joseph was able to produce the Book of Mormon. One of the things that they're doing in this is, or what they've basically concluded is, that there's syntax and vocabulary and so forth in the Book of Mormon text today that dates back to the early modern English, say the 1500s. And that it was long since antiquated by the time of the 1800s when Joseph Smith translated the text. Therefore, Joseph could not have translated the text. And what that means is that someone else in the spirit world or some other way conferred, or actually translated the text into Book of Mormon in early modern English, and then conferred that or relayed that to Joseph Smith, so that Joseph Smith was the transmitter, not the translator. You see that? He was not the translator, he was the transmitter of this early modern English translation. So I like to call that the EMEOT, for other translator theory. And you're going to be reading a lot about that and hearing about it because BYU Studies has recently published a book on this, and they're doing a big presentation in Provo in September and so forth. So I want to give you a little background, at least the way I perceive this. There are definitely a lot of interesting elements in the text of the Book of Mormon that people don't understand very well or can't explain. And I'm just going to list some of these and give some examples. The first one is the amount of repetition. Anyone who's read the Book of Mormon is familiar with the phrase, "and it came to pass," right? Now that phrase is found in the Bible, but not nearly as often as it is in the Book of Mormon. And if you've read the Book of Mormon, you know how many different phrases or terms in particular are found in there. In fact, it has a relatively low diversity of vocabulary. It has the same words repeated over and over and over. The second issue here, or element, is the amount of biblical language. As you know, there are parts of the Book of Mormon that directly quote from Isaiah, from the Sermon on the Mount, and so on. But there's also passages that either quote or allude to terminology that's used in the New Testament, for example. One of these is in 1 Nephi 1:14, and it says, "Great and marvelous are thy works. Are thy works." Now you can look that up and you'll find that that exact phrase, it's a little longer than this, but that exact phrase is found in the Book of Revelation, for example. So it looks like it was directly copied from the Book of Revelation. A third one on here that we like to talk about is just the vocabulary. And I mentioned before that there's not a lot of diversity in the vocabulary. It's the same words repeated over and over. But there's a lot of words in here that are archaic, that seem strange to us today. For example, the original version of the Book of Mormon, published in 1830, used the word "a" in front of infinitive verbs like a-going. I was a-going. Another interesting aspect of the vocabulary is the inconsistency. You read "hath" and "had" almost very often right in the same chapter. And they're kind of a mishmash of verbs that some are older and some are modern. The fourth one on here, and this is the one that led to the EME, I should put that up here. EME, other translator theory, is the problem with the syntax. And a common example that is supposedly archaic is in 3 Nephi, and it's a passage that is, I'm not going to diagram the whole passage, but I'm just going to show you what it is. 3 Nephi 2:3, and what it says is, "causing them that they should." So you see there's two objects and then the should verb at the end. That's considered a very archaic syntax that comes right back to early modern English, and so that's supposed to be evidence that the text is not in modern English, but it was actually translated by someone who was very familiar with early modern English, and then given to Joseph Smith, and he transmitted it to us, but he didn't actually translate it because he wasn't familiar with early modern English. Okay, now that's the background. Let's talk a little bit about how language works. And of course, there's all kinds of theories about language. You can watch TED Talks, you can read books, you can figure out all kinds of different nuances of how language works, but the basics are pretty simple to explain. Let's start with this idea, what I call a mental language bank. Let's take a person, we're going to draw a person here. He's got ears, he's got eyes, nose, he's got a mouth, lots of teeth. And then let's give him some hair. Let's give him, let's make him a missionary. So he's a missionary here, we'll say. Now, where's he going to first learn language? It's going to be from his family, right? From the people he grew up with. Starting in infancy. Actually, some people say starting in the womb. So you have, it's getting out of focus here a little bit. You have your family, which you listen to. So the input goes in here. And you observe what they do. Maybe you learn some writing at home or in school. So let's put school. School and environment generally. You get an input into your eyes, right? Ears and your eyes are your main input for language. Then the question is, what is it you're hearing? Let's say in this case, this person grew up in a family speaking French. What's going to come out of his mouth? Is he going to speak Spanish? Probably not. He's going to speak French. That seems pretty basic. I think we're all familiar with that. We all have a language we started our lives with, so we may have learned an additional language later. Now let's say that instead of French, this individual grew up with English. Now he speaks English. But there's more to it than that. Let's say the person grew up in Australia. Is he going to speak American English? Is he going to speak British English? No, he's going to speak Australian. There are big differences between these. And now with modern communications, it's not as stark as it used to be, but you could have British English, American English, Canadian English, all these different countries that developed their own regional dialects and their own, in many cases, their own vocabulary. One of our sons worked for Google, and his job, he was living in New Zealand, and his job was to optimize searches so that when people in New Zealand did a search on Google, it wouldn't give an American result. For example, a boot. If you're in New Zealand, that's the trunk of your car, but in America, it's something you wear on your feet. So you would want to have a search customized for each of these different English-speaking countries. All right, now, related to that, if you're speaking English, the point of showing the different countries was you have a dialect. And you speak the same dialect that you learn, okay? Now the next part of this is, apart from just the language itself, you have your family as an input, but what other materials do you have? And I'm going to take out this dialect here, and I'm going to move it over here, I guess. And we're going to talk about your secondary influences. So these are things that you read and other people you encounter. Certainly in the case of Joseph Smith, the Bible was a big influence. He talked about reading the Bible. So we know that the Bible was part of his, what I call, mental language bank. And there's more scientific terms for it, but that's, to me, that works. So, the Bible was one. What other things do we have? Now, we have some people who claim that, let's say this is a library. Like Michael Quinn is a scholar, for example, that seems to think Joseph Smith read every book in the library because he goes through and finds excerpts from different books, and he can find pretty much all the doctrines Joseph taught in one form or another in some book somewhere that was published in the world. Other people think he only read the Bible. That was it. So you have this extreme and this extreme. Seems to me naturally he would have read other books. In fact, if you read his own history as well as his mother's history, he says that he was concerned with the affairs in the world and he wanted to know kind of what was happening in the world. He was a deep thinker and so forth. So one of the other books that appears most likely he would have read is called The Late War. I'm going to erase this library for a minute to explain the late war. And the book The Late War was written in what they call an ancient historical style, meaning it was written to kind of sound like the Bible. In fact, the preface, the author and the people who endorsed it said that they hoped that this would encourage people to read the Bible because it was so similar, and it was an interesting story. The topic of it was the War of 1812. And that's significant because during the War of 1812, the British invaded many parts of the United States, but one of the areas they invaded was right around Palmyra. This is Lake Ontario. Here's Lake Erie down here. Buffalo is here. Maybe you can't see all that, but this is Ontario. And down here is where Palmyra is located. There's a little town called Pulteneyville you can visit today, right up here on the shores of Lake Ontario. And during the War of 1812, I think it was actually in 1814, the British invaded Pulteneyville. They fired cannons in there, they killed people, they stole stuff. Some of their soldiers were killed, so there were casualties on both sides. But this is Palmyra. And when Joseph Smith was not living in Palmyra at the time of the War of 1812, he was living over here in Vermont, and they moved to Palmyra a few years after, within 3 years or so after the end of the War of 1812. But there were veterans of the War of 1812 right here in Palmyra that Joseph would have known, his family would have known them. So it was very vivid at that time when this book came out, The Late War. When it was published, people wanted to read about the late war, and since it was in the biblical style, it was popular with people. It was published in several editions and so forth. So I think that that was one of the books he read. There were also other books written in this ancient historical style. One was the first book of Napoleon, and there are a few others. Well, what this all means is, in normal operation of language, as Joseph Smith grew up and began speaking and learning and articulating and so forth, the natural influences on him would have been these books that he read. So you have Bible. If you read journals and letters and things from those days, the early 1800s, a lot of people use biblical allusions just naturally in what they said, his mother being one of them. And she wrote she dictated actually a history called Lucy Max Smith's History that you can read about in the Joseph Smith papers. And I encourage you to read it because there's some really fascinating stuff in there. But a lot of it has biblical languages in it, phrases and terminology and so forth. Another would be the influence of these ancient historical style books. Because whenever you read something, especially if it's familiar to you because it's in biblical language, those phrases become part of your mental language bank, and naturally they come out when you speak again. That's how we learn to speak. Now, we all formulate phrases of our own that are unique, but it's using the tools that we're given, the inputs that we have. So what we would expect, particularly in a dictated book, and I should mention something about that, there's a big difference between writing and speaking. When we're speaking, we tend to have disjointed sentences, we tend to have a lot of repetition, and we have a lot of stock phrases because we're thinking so fast as we speak that we don't sit down and think to, you know, walk through exactly what we're saying. You can tell if you replay this video. I'm sure I have several sentences I've uttered that are run-on sentences or, you know, phrases, incomplete sentences, and so forth. Probably a lot of repetition because I'm just speaking naturally here. As a lawyer, I used to read a lot of trial transcripts, and when you read through trial transcripts, you see how people really talk, and it's nothing like if you read an actual written book. So there's a big distinction between dictation and writing. All right. And by the way, dictation has the elements that we talked about earlier in here. So let's quickly go back. I'm going to erase our character here. And let's look again at the 4 areas of concern that people have that led to this EME-OT scenario or idea. Number 1 was repetition. Now, as I just said, when we speak, we repeat a lot. So dictation, expected. When there's dictation, we expect to have repetition. The second one is biblical language. Now here again, since Joseph Smith read the Bible, he would have incorporated not only the vocabulary, but also the manner of speaking. And that's what you find throughout the Book of Mormon. However, you know, just let me make an aside there. People criticize the Book of Mormon because it includes some passages from the New Testament, like the one I just gave you from 1 Nephi 1:14, where the language that is attributed to Lehi is the same as the language in the Book of Revelation. That's exactly what we would expect, because Joseph Smith read the Bible. These phrases and usages and vocabulary were in his mind. That's what he drew from his mental bank. Just like when you go to the bank and make a deposit and you want to withdraw, you can only withdraw what you deposited, right? You can't, if you deposit $1,000, you can't go withdraw $100,000. So it's the same thing with the mental language bank, and that's why we normally can't speak French unless someone deposited that French language into our brains. So for Joseph Smith, he could only pull out what was put in there, which includes this biblical language. But here's the key, or one of the keys. In addition to the Bible, there are several passages in the Book of Mormon that are never found anywhere in the Bible, even some vocabulary. And that's where the Late War and other books, like the first book of Napoleon, come in, because both of those have phrases and usages that show up in the Book of Mormon that are not in the Bible. So it makes sense, when you understand how language works, it makes sense that this would happen. In fact, there's probably other sources. I have some ideas that I haven't researched on that, that would have contributed to Joseph's education and shown up in the language of the Book of Mormon. Because, again, it was dictated. None of this means it was copying the Bible or these other books. It just means that it was in Joseph's mental language bank. So I'm going to put those over here. I should have written it over here. Okay. Now, the next thing we talked about was the vocabulary, I think. And how do we come up with phrases like "I was a-going," or the mix mash between "hath" and "had" and various archaic words mixed in with modern words? Well, that's exactly how his family spoke. And you can see it in the various accounts. Fourth was the issue of syntax. And if you remember, I gave you the passage, I think it was from 3 Nephi 2:3, that supposedly his evidence could only have come from the early modern English other translator theory. However, there's a very interesting passage in D&C 5:3. And I'm going to write this out on here, and you'll see that it follows the exact same archaic syntax as the other one. It says, I have caused you that you should. Maybe you can't read that very well, but I have caused, that's the same as the one from 3 Nephi, you. Remember that was that first pronoun, that you, repeated the pronoun, should. So it's exactly the same supposedly early modern English syntax, but it's in D&C 5:3. Now the reason that's significant, this is before Joseph Smith translated any of the Book of Mormon, at least any of the Book of Mormon we have today. And so it's evidence, again, that Joseph spoke that way naturally, or that the Lord speaking through him drew on his vocabulary and syntax, which is D&C 5:3. This is not a translation. Not a translation. So you'll see in my blogs, if you read those, I know they're detailed, but if you see in there that all the examples given of early modern English show up either in the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, or Lucy's history, because that was the language that Joseph Smith grew up with, and that's how he spoke normally. In fact, well, I won't get into that too much, but many of his contemporaries used the same phrases that were supposedly early modern English. And the reason for that is, I'm going to explain two things here, and then we'll be done. First is, I want to go through the idea of colonial lag. Now, we have another son who was in New Zealand, and he's a lawyer there, and when he was admitted to the bar, he had to go out and rent a wig. You know, you've all seen the British wigs that they have, and in order to appear in the court and be admitted and so on. But as I recall, New Zealand is the only Commonwealth nation that still has a wig. In England, they did away with them a long time ago. In Australia, they've done away with them. They still have them in some African countries, as I've mentioned on the blog. But this wig is an old custom that originated in England and then was transported to New Zealand and Australia. Let me sketch that. Here's England, here's Africa, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. So the British people went all the way, say through the Suez Canal, all the way over to Australia and New Zealand, and they took the wig with them, as the lawyers did. Well, the British got rid of it, Aussies got rid of it, but the Kiwis here in New Zealand still wear the wig in court. And it makes no sense logically, but it's an old tradition that they've retained. And the same thing happens with language. I've explained that in more detail on the blog, but basically if you have colonies like the British did in the United States, of course, it was a colony, and they came over from different parts of England. Let's say this is England. There's Scotland up here, Wales, Northern Ireland is part of Ireland, and then there's different areas within England. Back then, these different regions would have their own dialects, their own special adaptations, let's say, of the English language. And so when they went to America from these different areas, depending on where they settled, that became predominant. And then after independence, the English language continued to develop here in England differently than it did in the United States. That's why we have American English, British English, and so forth. We don't notice it as much now because American English has been homogenized because of modern communications. But even still, if you go to some areas of the United States, and the Appalachians is one that's studied a lot, you'll see there are some regional variations yet today. Well, in the 1800s, there were plenty of them. The other is a faulty assumption. The people who did this research assumed that they could find evidence of how people spoke in written texts. So they did these studies called n-grams, where they would search for a word that is in a huge database of all the printed texts of different times. And they could say this word, let's say a particular word originated in 1500, Here's a chart. It originated in 1500. It was very popular then. And then maybe by 1600, it kind of was used less until it faded. Other times you might see a spike here, a spike here, a spike here, a spike here. And maybe in the 1830s, it was a low where people weren't using that word in their printed material. Therefore, these guys say, well, if Joseph Smith used a word here that was more popular back here, it must have been someone in the 1500s who did the translation. I think you can see the fallacy there, because the idea that everything that is spoken is written is, I was going to say absurd, but I don't want to say that. Let's just say that it's counterfactual. I mean, we all know that the words we speak, even with social media, we say a lot of things that are never recorded or published. But back then, of course, most people had no access to writing or publishing books, and their little regional dialects never made it outside of their town. Fortunately, though, we have the advantage of having Joseph Smith's additional dictated documents, like the Doctrine and Covenants, like I just showed you, as well as most of the Pearl of Great Price he dictated. Then his mother's history, she dictated. So we can see their patterns of speech, the kind of words that they use, the syntax, the repetition, all that same stuff is in there. And I've documented that pretty much on the blog, and I'll have it in more detail in my book, my next book. Okay, so that's that part of it, colonial lag. And that explains why Joseph Smith used the words and the syntax and the repetition and so on that he did. I think that pretty well covers it. I think it's important for us to understand this, because really the Book of Mormon is and the foundational story is being attacked by two sides. You have Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. Now, obviously these two men worked closely together, but they were key in translating the Book of Mormon, publishing the Book of Mormon. These were the two who received the priesthood from John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John, Moses, Elijah, and so forth. So these were some people refer to them as the founding prophets. I've heard people say, well, Oliver Cowdery wasn't a prophet. But in the scriptures it says he was an apostle. He was also the assistant president of the church, which, according to how we sustain prophecies and revelators, he was a prophet in that sense as well. And the assistant president, by the way, is an office that we don't have any longer. But organizationally back then you had the president, the assistant president, and then the first and second counselors. So Oliver Cowdery was higher in authority, let's say, than the first and second counselors in the first presidency. It would be as though there was another person. Today we have President Nelson, we have Oakes, and President Eyring. If there was another person in there senior to President Oakes and President Eyring, that would be the position Oliver Cowdery had. So when people say he was not a prophet, we shouldn't believe him and so on, this is what we're talking about. The other aspect of this is that Oliver Cowdery was the spokesman for Joseph Smith. He's the one that wrote most of he wrote almost all the Book of Mormon, as well as part of the Pearl of Great Price. And he wrote these series of 8 essays that I won't get into in this presentation. But he was key to the foundation of the church. And in church history, he was widely recognized and respected for that. Now, these men are being attacked in two ways. You have anti-Mormons, or let's say critics, who say Joseph Smith wasn't a prophet, he made it up, it's fiction, didn't translate. It was wrong. And then you have intellectuals in the church who are faithful, they're good members of the church, they serve, they do wonderful things. But they also say they were wrong, In particular, they were wrong about Hill Cumorah. Again, that's a topic for another video. But they also say they were wrong about translating, because of the EME, other translator theory. In other words, they're saying that the Book of Mormon is not simple and dumb like the critics say, simple. Instead, they're saying it's too sophisticated. That Joseph Smith could not possibly have understood early modern English syntax well enough to produce the Book of Mormon. So those are two different lines of attack that are basically the same thing. And these are coming from faithful people, these are coming from people who reject the whole thing. But the point is, it has to do with the credibility and reliability of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. The third area here is the plates. And you have intellectuals now saying Joseph Smith didn't even use them. They were under a cloth the whole time. They serve sort of as a talisman to, I don't know, give Joseph Smith power or something, but they say he never even opened the plates, or if he did open them, he didn't use them when he was translating. All he did was look at a stone and a hat, and that was it. So these three areas, the idea that they were wrong about the Hill Cumorah, that Joseph didn't actually translate the book, and that he didn't even use the plates, are areas of attack on the credibility of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. And today we just talked about this translating one. But we'll have others on these two topics as we go. Well, I hope this has been helpful, probably too long, but at least gave you an idea of some things to think about. Thanks.